Marc MacSharry.
Thanks very much, Ciancola. I realise the line ministers aren't here because everyone is taking their turn to lay out their own department position. Our party position was very well articulated by our senior spokesman, Deputy Chambers, and I don't want to go over that. Obviously, we would be supporting it, and I think everyone in the House is very much donning the green jersey in that regard. And we all hope none of this ever has to pass. But it would be remiss not to be critical of the timing of it. And while I can appreciate that the ministers may have thought, or governments may have taken the position that, look, let's not have the UK thinking we're fully prepared and that we don't really need a backstop at all, and therefore let's leave it till the last minute to kind of do this legislation. And as Deputy O'Dea has said, with about 10 days to go, time is short. And I do have a problem with it because it's not the enabling legislation to allow for certain measures to be implemented or to allow for certain things to happen. It's what the tangibles that are going to affect, the various sectors and society that are going to be needed in terms of support, in terms of compensation, in terms of keeping people in jobs and in their livelihoods if disaster does strike and there is a no-deal Brexit. And I think that the kind of consultation that has taken place with the various sectors has fallen short. And I think that on one hand, while we might want to be careful not to show our hand in a negotiating position as within the EU with the British, I think that we've been remiss in not fully engaging with the various sectors in society, social and commercial, in preparing the sort of measures that we are going to have to implement in order to keep Ireland's socio-economic fabric functioning. And obviously, being from one of the 6 border counties, we are set to be hit probably more significantly than anywhere else in the country. I'm sure, like everybody, we're suffering from Brexit fatigue. It's like war and peace cubed to the power of infinity in terms of length. It's like a pantomime in terms of the ongoing, you don't need the backstop, you do need the backstop, we're not reopening the backstop. Yes, they will reopen the backstop, and on we go. I mean, looking at Sky News and the House of Commons coverage, I think could give us supreme confidence in how we do our business in here when you look at times to see the car crash which is happening in Westminster. I feel we need more leadership from government on this, as I said, in terms of the tangibles. And I want to give a couple of examples. So if you looked at the dairying sector alone, and in the 6 border counties, some 20% of the milk pool comes from the north of Ireland. And in fact, the north of Ireland doesn't have the processing capacity to deal with that milk themselves. So it comes south to ourselves, into Donegal, into Sligo, into Leitrim, Cavan, Monaghan and Louth. And as things stand, if there was a no-deal Brexit, there'll be a total nightmare with the number of loads that have to come forward, come across the border for processing. There's been negotiations, I know, with some in the dairying sector with revenue in terms of inward processing relief. But I'm told the administrative burden involved in that would be like something like a tonne of paperwork for each load of milk that's coming in. And I think we need to be cognizant of measures that are being put in place to ensure that the administrative burden isn't prohibitive to businesses. But the dairying sector is one, considering 20% of the raw material is coming south, that can and will cause major problems. The 3, I suppose, co-ops that are most affected, there will be Orivo in the northwest, Glanbia and Lakelands. And there is a major issue with how those people are going to do their business. And there's nothing in the legislation today to show us or give guidance of how things are going to operate. And that's why I would ask that from a trade perspective that we need to be liaising with the sectoral interests. So in the context of dairying, the various cooperatives or their umbrella organisation or NUA. Equally on dairying, with the biggest supplier, to example, Tesco of cheddar cheese. And very substantial suppliers of butter into the UK. So take cheese as an example, about 23% of all of cheese sold in Britain comes from here. It's about 3,000 per tonne In the event of a no-deal Brexit, that price becomes €4,671 per tonne. That's the tariff, 1,671 under the GATT rules, which would be a total disaster. So how are we going to square that circle? What level of compensation? What funds are in place? Is it coming from the EU? Do we have to come up with our own resources? Similarly with beef, huge amount of our beef, up to 40% of fresh beef goes into the UK market. Tariffs there, depending on what it is, 40 to 70%. How are we going to cover that? I'm from the northwest. Many would say those 4 or 5 counties up there, the engine room of the suckler herd nationally, which produces a lot of our beef. What are we going to do for those? Many of them small farming families dependent on very modest incomes. And all of a sudden their product is going to be up to 70% less competitive than it was yesterday. And that's in an era where there's already a beef crisis, where the multiples, factories and so on are leveraging their positions at the expense of small farming families. So that's something that needs to be done. As things stand, just back to dairying for a second, the Ornua and the various cooperatives, there isn't space in a cold store or chill at the moment in Britain, because they have stockpiled butter and cheese for 6 to 9 months' supply. They're literally stacked in the aisles now in cold stores and chills. That's a cash outlay from our dairying industry so far of 200 to 400 million. And that's before there's no deal or a deal or whatever. So there's already been a tremendous cost on industry, and that needs to be taken on board. The haulage industry is totally in the dark and feel that they've received no clarification on the situation regarding non-Irish drivers crossing what Minister Ross likes to refer to as the land bridge. This will have a detrimental impact on time-sensitive products such as fresh food, meat and so on, dairy products. And incredibly, Minister Ross, when tackled about this at the Transport Committee, where the members of all parties and none said, look, you need to engage with the sector. And his response was, quote, I can't see how the department publicly discussing using the UK as a very handy land bridge and discussing the vital importance of it with haulage reps actually helps our negotiating position. The UK will not appreciate being as little more than a convenient gateway to Europe for Ireland. So that frightens me, frankly, because as I said at the beginning, fine, we need to be cautious and strategic in terms of our negotiating position, but not at the expense of the appropriate engagement with sectoral interests. And I mentioned dairying, beef finish and so on, and here's a prime example with the haulage, for example, of the Minister not engaging and feeling that the good excuse for that is that strategically it could weaken our negotiating position. And I don't buy that, and it worries me, frankly. The Departments of Business and Agriculture have jointly leveraged exchequer funding of about 300 million for a loan scheme for businesses impacted by Brexit. But 40% of the fund has been ring-fenced, as we know, for the food sector. But from PQ responses that I've seen, that of 42 eligible applications for food companies, just 8 have been sanctioned for finance under this loan scheme. So this effectively means 1 in 5 eligible loan applications for the sector have been approved. So it's like a box-ticking exercise. Look, that money is there, but what sort of underwriting criteria are we applying? Is it prohibitive? I mean, are we really looking to give this money out and help people and give them the supports they need, or are we, talking the talk without walking the walk? So if we're putting measures in place, let's make it available to people, and certainly the lend-out rate so far does not give confidence. And 1 in 5, I mean, of 42 eligible applications, only 8. I mean, overnight, if we have a no deal, how are we going to get money to where it's needed very, very fast? And I think a prohibitive underwriting or application criteria is not going to assist us in that. And that's what that particular scheme it would suggest to me is not fit for purpose in that regard. Apart from that, and again, just concluding, obviously we're going to support the legislation. Obviously we'll don the green jersey. But I do fear that at the expense of a strategic position of not showing our hand in our negotiating position, we are not adequately prepared in terms of the tangible measures that we will be expected to implement instantaneously in a no-deal Brexit, and that's getting cash to people they need it, making people, ensuring that businesses can operate. And I think the absence of the appropriate sectoral consultation is telling. And very, very worrying, and I think we need to up our game very much in that regard. Very finally, the 6 border counties, the Cancórla zone, my own, and the others that I've mentioned earlier, are clearly going to be the most affected. And I think post-Brexit, deal or no deal, I think a special package of measures needs to be made available for those 6 counties in terms of farming and agriculture and food production, in terms of infrastructure, cross-border connectivity, and also capital city and port and airport connectivity for Donegal, Sligo, Leitrim, Cavan, Monaghan and Louth is pretty well serviced as it is in terms of motorways and so on, but the rest of us are not. And I would like to see government prioritising that and not using the post-Brexit scenario as an opportunity to resource parts of the country that perhaps are better placed to meet challenges than the 6 counties on the border themselves. And I hope that government will be able to prioritise that. Thank you, Cancórla.